Now I'm ready to talk about George Dunning and Yellow Submarine. George Dunning is another really important animator to come out of the National Film Board of Canada. And he came from an art school background too. He went to the Ontario School of Art. He made a few really awesome short films, including one called Three Blind Mice in 1945. Here's a short clip of that.
See how they run. This is the story we have to tell. The safety rules they knew full well. Three blind mice, three blind mice. See how they run. They seem to be resting, but my, oh me, they're resting from making a salary. They forgot to check their machinery. These three blind mice, three blind mice, three blind mice. Don't they have fun? Don't they have fun? Each one was working away serene, not using a guard on the hooded machine. Each paid in the end. You know what I mean. Those three blind mice.
He co-founded his own production company in Canada. He went to Paris and worked with Bertolt Barsch, who's another really important Czech-born animator. I mean, basically, he did a lot of stuff. He worked with UPA briefly in the 1950s as well. And eventually, he was hired to direct the Beatles' Yellow Submarine because he had started working in London. This film, funny thing about this film and the Beatles, this film came about because the Beatles had this kind of contractual obligation to Universal to produce a third film. So if you're not a Beatles fan like me, you maybe don't know that the first two films are Hard Day's Night and Help, both of which you should watch. They're so good. In fact, I mean, if you have time on your hands, what I would honestly do is I would stop right now, go watch Hard Day's Night, go watch Help, and then come back and watch Yellow Submarine. And while you're watching Hard Day's Night, consider that it's one of the best documentaries of the 1960s. And it is really, really influenced by documentary style and the way that it was changing in the early 1960s. If you want to talk about that, I am super happy to talk about that. Let's just talk about Hard Day's Night or Help. They're both amazing movies. Anyway, I digress. Okay, so George Dunning said, the film, apart from story and plot, was designed as an experience. Feature film audiences want this sensation or experience. Since the film was made of drawings and painting, we decided to bring in all the images familiar to the popular mind that we could. A lot of that is gonna be trippy, man. It also helps that one of the main artists who worked on this film was a guy named Heinz Edelman. Heinz Edelman was an artist and kind of a newcomer to animation, but he was kind of mixing pop art with the floral decorativism of Neo-Liberty, which was an Italian architecture movement. But he was all about psychedelic hallucinations. So he was the guy who was responsible for all of the drawing in Yellow Submarine. This movie is meant to be a long and colorful trip. I mean, this is arguably, perhaps with 2001: A Space Odyssey, the quintessential psychedelic movie. The plot of this movie is maybe a little bit thin, but that means that you can map your own meanings and interpretations onto it. So be thinking about what those meanings might be. We're all watching this in our own homes, so smoke them if you got them. Don't do drugs, kids, I'm serious. This is basically an excuse for all kinds of pictorial references, all kinds of symbols. You know, there are some symbols that might end up being a little bit more universal than others, but this is a movie that invites you to read into it. So don't be afraid to read into this movie. One of the other interesting things about this movie is that it ends up being this balance between artistic creation and commercial success, and in many ways becomes a symbol of the protest movements that are happening around this time in the late 1960s in both Britain and the US, and frankly all over the world. So, you know, what's going on in the 1960s that might feed into imagery in this film? I mean, if you've taken any classes with me before, you've probably heard this ad nauseum. We talk about social movements of the 1960s as being really influential on art and popular culture. all the time, but you've got Vietnam, you've got youth protests, you've got the civil rights movement, you have Stonewall, you have women, you have the second wave feminist movement. So if I were teaching this class in person, I would give you what my favorite handout, the things that happened in 1968 handout. So instead, I'm just going to post it, but feel free to just look at all the things that happened in 1968, the same year that this movie came out, and try to get a sense of what life was like. Now, in the past, when I've taught this film, it's hard for us to really imagine how crazy things might be in 1968, but we don't have that problem anymore. Things are very crazy here in 2020, and I don't think that you're going to have a problem at all imagining what it was like in 1968 and the kinds of escapism that were perhaps necessary to just cope with everyday life. Oh, take it down a notch, Carrie. So while you're watching, think about the influence of 1960s counterculture on this film. Think about the legacy of this film as maybe one of the quintessential psychedelic films. How has psychedelia continued to influence popular culture? Why a submarine? What kind of metaphors are at work in this film? What are the Pepperlanders like? What kind of utopian imagery do we see? And what kind of dystopian imagery do we see? You might fruitfully compare this film to something like Pink Floyd's The Wall, which I also recommend that you watch. In fact, if you really wanted to have an amazing day, you should watch all the Beatles films and then you should watch Pink Floyd's The Wall. And then call me. I gave you my cell phone number. I'll talk to you. But what statements about ideal society does this film make? What's the relationship between the man-made world and nature here? What about color symbolism? What about puns? What about poetry? What do you see in this film? And where do you see a relationship to surrealism? We talked a little bit about surrealism. We talked a little bit about Dada, but there's quite a bit of art for art's sake here, and yet always tinged with that kind of smack of commercialism, because this was a very successful film. You will also have a potential journal question about the relationship with this film and more honestly avant-garde films and animators like Harry Smith, whose animation often made use of collage, cutting things out and sticking them to other things. So you will have a journal question that asks you to consider that relationship as well. Okay, I hope you enjoy Yellow Submarine, and I can't wait to talk about it with you in the discussion board.